Uh, yes, ma'am, we are unmuting you. Good evening, friends, and happy Ganesh Chaturthi. And on a weekend, on a festive day, we are bothering you, but we always felt that sharing a knowledge on a festive day gives a different perspective, and that too on a Ganesh Chaturthi. Uh, Amongst us today, in our pursuit to have sessions which could have an illuminating paths of knowledge from speakers who can shed their lights of knowledge in a capsule form. We requested Ma'am Ananda Gomati Murgasan to give insights on the topic and perspective, especially during these testing times, on the topic of auctions and sales of property under the SARFAESI Act 2002. And she was kind enough to accede to our request to give the insights as what we have shared with you, that she is having knowledge, though I say immense, but she puts a caveat. She says I don't have the immense, but we feel that if one could have that much knowledge and perspective of law on the part of SARFAESI as well as on the auction proceedings, which is an important facet, with not only within the SARFAESI Act but even otherwise, what are the rights of the auction purchaser, or what are the rights the borrower has, or what the mortgagee has. These all wide spectrums of law, though it looks to be a very small act, but it has different facets. And again, taking cue from what ma'am has said, that we shouldn't speak much about her. She says, let my knowledge itself should give the insights and let the participants itself judge. So we always believe that our knowledge and insight and whatever we gathered during all these discussions as to how to go about with the sessions, I could at least make, I was quite sacrosanct that we are pushing forward in the right direction for having the knowledge sharing through her. And on the platform, I also find Mr. S. Parthasarthi has probably also joined. Welcome to him, being an institution within himself. And thank you to all the participants who are watching us on the platform and sharing the knowledge, sharing and caring the knowledge with us, as well as those who are watching us live on the Facebook. Once again, Happy Ganesh Chaturthi. And over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vikas. Am I audible?
Yes, and screen sharing you will be doing, ma'am?
Sorry? Yes,
screen sharing.
Yes. I will.
Yes, okay.
Yes, a very good evening to every one of you who are online. And yes, I also understand that my senior is here, Mr. S. Parthasarthi. So it is indeed a test for me here around. And when I had the invite from Mr. Vikas, I had been to the platform and I did see the various topics that had been covered by SLS law. And I was quite intrigued to find that the platform had been visited by several eminent lawyers, my seniors from the Madras Bar and several High Court judges, retired and sitting. So it is with a kind of a fear, or rather I would say a kind of an anxiety that I would have to deliver my speech today. So we are today going to be discussing on the Securitization Act, and more particularly with respect to auctions and sale under the Securitization Act. As we all know, this legislation was passed in the year 2002, and it came into being in order to control the ever-rising non-performing assets that had come to cripple the country. But however, after the act was passed, it earned itself the reputation that it was a draconian act. And I would also say, rightly so. This is an act by which a quasi-judicial authority, who is in fact a person who is deputed by a bank or a financial institution, is vested with powers to take over the properties and to sell and realize the dues that would be due to the financial institution. Now, as we all know, a right of property basically is not only a constitutional right. It may not be a fundamental right, but it is a constitutional right, and it is also a human right. A right being as sacrosanct as that is now sought to be intervened by a quasi-judicial authority without an intervention of law. And that being the case, this act being a special enactment has a set of procedures which are very clearly laid down in the act in order to wield the power. Now, getting to the act, to the provisions of the act has evolved over a long period of time. It came into being in 2002, and it has since then been there until now, that is 2020. We have been having the act with us for almost 18 years. And in all these 18 years, it has slowly evolved little by little. And today I would say that it has very clearly laid down the procedures the doubts that could have arisen in the execution of the act have mostly been addressed upon. So I will now deliver my speech in two parts. For the purpose of this lecture, I am only going to dwell on the auction and sale of properties. I am not going to be handling the other portions of the act like the physical possession or rather the ARCs. The act is a vast one, but I am limiting myself only to these sections. So I would only be dwelling on sections that are related to sale and auction of properties. So getting into the act is set in motion by invoking section 13(2) of the act. Now, for an act even to come into place, there are three vital ingredients that are needed. The first is that an account of a borrower with a bank must have been classified as an NPA. Unless there is a classification of an NPA by the bank in clear terms, the act can never be set in motion. The next is that there has to be a debt due. Unless there is a legally recoverable debt, the act cannot be set in motion. And the most important part of all is that there has to be a secured asset in the form of a mortgaged property or by means of a hypotheca. The act, as far as in my practice I have found, does not handle much with movable properties. Immovable properties have always been the subject matter where securitization has been invoked. So I will also confine my speech to the immovable properties execution under the act. Now I will take you to the various provisions of the act. Give me a moment so that I will share the screen. Yes. So the act starts with section 13(2). I will read out the provisions starting from section 13(2) to 13(4), and thereon I will also then thereafter dwell on the various judgments that came to be passed under the act. Section 13(2) states that where any borrower who is under a liability to a secured creditor under a security agreement makes any default, please give me a moment, there is a lot of, yes. So where who is under a liability to a secured creditor under a security agreement makes any default and repayment of the debt or any installment thereof, and his account in respect of that debt is classified by the secured creditor as a non-performing asset.
Ananta ma'am, just stop the annotation because somebody is scribbling, though I would request the participant not to do the scribbling, but just stop the annotation so that the scribbling is not there. I sent you the screenshot in the before the session.
I have the annotation. I'm able to see that it says annotate, but it doesn't give me the option to
stop annotation. You will find. I've shared the screenshot with you on your WhatsApp as to how it can be stopped. Though I will request the participants not to do that because we are having knowledge sharing. Let's not scribble and make it bad.
I would rather request that because I am not able to see here the option to stop the annotation. It only says stop share. So if I say that, then the screen sharing.
No, the screen sharing will stop. I've shared the screenshot with you. Just check it on the mobile.
I did, but disable. Yes.
Yes.
I have it.
No. And first, now just undo that so that that blue scribbling which has been done is done away. There's a mark of the eraser also. Just use that so that the screen sharing will do that. Do away with that.
I'm not getting that, but I think that should
it's
be
fine. We can from the rest of the screens there will not be any problem. Yes.
Yes. So section 13(2) that we have here on the screen is about the issuance of a demand notice by a secured creditor or a bank. It emanates from an authorized officer. And I will just go through the section very briefly so that these are the most important sections which will have to be followed for a property to be brought for sale. So where any borrower who is under a liability to a secured creditor under a security agreement makes any default and repayment of the secured debt or an installment, and his account in respect of such debt is classified as a non-performing asset, then the secured creditor may require the borrower by notice and writing to discharge his in full his liabilities to the secured creditor within 60 days from the date of notice, failing which the secured creditor shall be entitled to exercise all or any of the rights under subsection 4. So looking at this section, there are a few criteria that are essential for a 13(2) notice to emanate, as I already said. One is that there has to be a legally enforceable debt. And the second is that there has to be a default and the account has to be classified as an NPA. So when a demand notice emanates, the demand notice must compulsorily give 60 days time for the law to be set in motion. Then thereafter, once a 13(2) is issued, then what happens? Once a 13(2) is issued, the borrower thereafter has only one remedy. A 13(2) does not entail a borrower to approach. Please give me a moment. I need to take it to the next slide in my PowerPoint. And
just scroll to the second screen share.
all right.
On the right side, you will find the next one. You can click it. You could have probably you have disabled your screen sharing itself. Just check it on that.
No, I am. It says that I am on screen sharing. It doesn't say that.
Just click on section 13(2) and just click, then it will shift to the second one.
What I've been trying to do.
We are all sharing during these testing times. You can ask your son, daughter to do it, or your son.
Yeah, I have a son. He's here. He's trying to do that.
I'm down, but I'm pressing. Down, but I'm pressing.
No, I think
just try to, or you can stop the screen share. 30. No, 30.
no, I'm not
probably
able to.
it's section 13(2).
No, I want to get to 13(3)(a) because we've just finished 13(2).
You can remove this and post the second share. Again, relog on the screen share.
Yeah, probably I could do that. I'll just stop and I'll relog again. All right. So we are not.
You continue. I will ask some associate of mine if they can help you.
Yes. So after 13(2), I think most of us would be also very well aware of the provisions. So then I will go on to next to section 13(3)(a). So a demand notice under section 13(2) does not confer any right on a borrower to approach a court of law at that point of time because it is always considered only to be a show cause notice. Thereafter, section 13(3)(a), all the right that can accrue to a borrower is to lodge his objections with the authorized officer under section 13(3)(a). When an objection is raised by a borrower or a guarantor for that matter with an authorized officer making out the reasons as to why the demand notice ought not to have been issued.
And somebody has said you will do undo the eraser part, then it will start working. Just try that.
Sorry.
Because I am also undo the eraser part. You have done that, so it will automatically start.
What do I undo here?
Eraser part. Probably you've done that. That somebody posted out here. Ma'am, first undo the eraser.
No, I'm not able to.
What you can do is first remove the screen sharing, then post it again. Probably it will
Alright,
start
I
working.
could do that. I could do that.
Yeah, and now try that. Meanwhile, I will call my associate. You can do with that. I will ask someone to do.
Yes. So we have this here. Am I now? Is the screen now visible? Is the screen now visible?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So then we are now here on section 13(3)(a). So this is what it says. So if on receipt of a notice under subsection 2, the borrower makes any representation or raises any objections, the secured creditor shall consider such objection or representation, and if the secured creditor comes to a conclusion that such representation or objection is not acceptable or tenable, he shall communicate within 50 days of receipt of such representation or objection the reasons for non-acceptance of the representation or objections to the borrower. Now section 13(3)(a) here, this is the only right that is available to a borrower under section 13(3)(a) once the 13(2) demand notice is issued until 13(4) thereafter continues. Therefore here, when a borrower issues a objection to the authorized officer, it is mandatory on the part of an authorized officer to reply to this representation within 15 days. If it is not replied, then all other actions that are taken pursuant to that fall to the ground. So then after 13(3)(a) comes section 13(4). So the next is here. In case the borrower fails to discharge his liability in full within the period specified in subsection 2, the secured creditor may take recourse to one or more of the following measures to recover his secured debt, namely taking possession of the secured assets of the borrower, including the right of transfer by way of lease, assignment or sale for realizing the secured asset. The next one would be taking over the management, and third, provided that the right of transfer by way of lease, assignment or sale shall be exercised only where the substantial part of the business of the borrower is held as security for the debt. So that is with respect to where a business is taken over and transferred. Now here we are only going to be dealing with sale of the immovable properties. And then the next one would also be talking about the management of a business of a borrower. So I'll just sift through it very quickly. So provided that the management of the whole of the business or a part of the business is severable, the secured creditor shall take over the management of such business of the borrower which is relatable to the security, and then appoint a person to manage the secured asset, and require at any time by notice in writing any person who has acquired the secured assets and from whom any money is due to become or may become due to pay the secured creditor. So these are the, after this, then thereafter, section 13(4), we have section 13(5). Now that is a very important section that came to be passed by the legislation. Now I have again here, yes, so here I am with section 13(5). In 13(5), any payment, now the first one, 5A is more important than 5. Any payment made by a person referred to in clause D or subsection 4 to the secured creditor shall give a person a valid discharge. Now kindly look at 5A. This is a very recent addition where the sale of an immovable property for which a reserve price has been specified has been postponed for want of a bid of an amount not less than such reserve price, it shall be lawful for any officer of the secured creditor, if so authorized by the secured creditor in this behalf, to bid for the immovable property on behalf of the secured creditor at any subsequent sale. This here, so what happened when this particular section came into vogue is that where an auction was brought, where a property was brought for sale and it could not be sold at the reserve price, in the next auction, the banks have started taking over the properties of such borrowers, and they have started to purchase it themselves. So this is a very new addition, and in fact, after that, we also have the continuation. So where the secured creditor referred in subsection 5A is declared to be the purchaser of the immovable property at any subsequent sale, the amount of the purchase price shall be adjusted towards the amount of the claim of the secured creditor for which the auction of the enforcement of security interest is taken by the secured creditor under subsection 4 of section 13. The provisions of section 9 of the Banking Regulation Act 1949 shall as far as may be apply to the immovable property acquired by the secured creditor under subsection 5A. So it was because of these kind of sections that the act started getting the name of a draconian act, and that would that has been my view. And then we get on to section 13(6). So any transfer of secured asset after taking possession thereof or takeover of the management under subsection 4 by the secured creditor or by the management shall vest in the transferee all rights in or in relation to the secured asset transfer, as if the transfer had been made by the owner of such secured asset. So the authorized officer thereafter on taking possession becomes as good as the owner of the property. Now section 13(7). When any action has been taken against a borrower under the provisions of subsection 4, all costs, charges, expenses, which in the opinion of the secured creditor have been properly incurred by him, or any expenses incidental thereto, shall be recoverable from the borrower, and the money which is received shall, in the absence of a contract to the contrary, be held by him in trust to be applied first in payment of costs, charges, and expenses, and secondly in discharge of the dues of the secured creditor, and the residue shall be paid to the person entitled in accordance with his rights and interests. So this is about the appropriation of the money after the sale takes place. Now section 13(8). This is one of the most argued sections in the Securitization Act. It talks of the right of redemption. Here it says, where the amount of dues of the secured creditor, together with all costs, charge, and expenses incurred by him, is tendered to the secured creditor at any time before the date of publication of notice for a public auction, or inviting quotation or tender from public or private realty for transfer by way of lease, assignment, or sale of the secured assets. Now here we may have to notice this section much more clearly, because earlier this section said that where the amounts of a secured creditor would be tendered by a borrower or by a person whose property was brought for sale before the sale was completed, then it amounted to a discharge of his liability. The mortgage was supposed to be ready. But now here it has become slightly tougher and says where now the opportunity to redeem a property is given only until the date of publication of a sale notice for a public auction. But however, this section also has a rider. Now next, thereafter I will go to section 13(13), but in section 13(8), there is also a rider along with it, which is actually an enabling provision as far as I have seen. Now I'll also read section 13(13) and then go back to section 13(8). Now section 13(13) says that no borrower, the other sections I have skipped because it would become too long and it would not be very relevant to what the subject that we are talking on hand. So I have thereafter skipped the other sections and gone on to section 13(13). So now section 13(13) says that no borrower shall, after receipt of notice referred to in subsection 2, transfer by way of sale, lease, or otherwise, other than in ordinary course of his business, any of his secured assets referred to in the notice without the prior written consent of the secured creditor. So once a demand notice is issued, the borrower loses all rights of handling the property. So he cannot enter into an agreement of sale. He cannot enter into lease deeds. He cannot handle the property in any manner known to law. But of course, however, practically here on receipt of a demand notice, borrowers do keep receiving the rents until a bank makes an application or exercises its right to receive the rents. So that would be section 1313. Now we will just move on to the rules. The Act also has a set of rules. Rule 8 and Rule 9 of the security interest rules basically deal with the various procedures under which section 13(4) is executed by an authorized officer. So we will just go through the rules and then see how the law had evolved over a period of time. A sale of an immovable secured asset, Rule 8. So where a secured asset is an immovable property, I have omitted the movable property from my talk because there have not been much instances of banks selling movables. And this by itself would be quite a subject where, so many new judgments and the law has evolved. So I thought I will confine myself to immovable secured assets. So here it goes. Where the secured asset is an immovable property, the authorized officer shall take or cause to be taken possession by delivering a possession notice prepared as nearly as possible in Appendix 4 to these rules to the borrower and by affixing the possession notice on the outdoor of or at such conspicuous place of the property. So there are three procedures that are enumerated here. One is that the authorized officer can take possession or he can depute somebody to take possession. And the second thing is that he has to deliver a possession notice which is as nearly possible as to Appendix 4. The Appendix 4 is always found in the books. It is always available. And the third one would be affixing the possession note. And then the possession notice referred to in sub-rule 1 shall also be published as soon as possible, but not in less than 7 days from the date of taking possession in 2 leading newspapers, one in vernacular language, having sufficient circulation in that locality by the authorized officer. So a publication of the possession notice is to be followed immediately or rather simultaneously when a possession of a property is taken. And then, now this is an addition. So all notice under these rules may also be served upon the borrower through electronic mode of service in addition to the modes prescribed under sub-rule 1 and sub-rule 2 of Rule 8. So it is not only that the borrower has to be served by way of an RPAD or by a courier or by hand delivery. The Act also now enables the banks or the authorized officer to serve them through an email. And then in the event of a possession of an immobile property is actually taken by an authorized officer, such property shall be kept in his own custody or in the custody of any person authorized or appointed by him, who shall take as much care of the property in his custody as the owner of ordinary prudence would, under these similar circumstances, take off such property. So under this rule, a great responsibility is thrust on the authorized officer to preserve the properties which actual possession is taken off as if he were the owners of the property. And that is again reiterated in Rule 8.4. The authorized officer shall take steps for preservation and protection of the secured assets and insure them if necessary till they are sold or otherwise disposed of. And then we get to Rule 8.5. This is from here the sale starts. So before effecting the sale of an immovable property referred to in subsection 1 of Rule 9, the authorized officer shall obtain a valuation. So let us now go. These are all the nitty-gritties that are actually available in the Act and which will have to be scrupulously followed. So here it goes. The authorized officer shall obtain a valuation of the property from an approved valuer and in consultation with the secured creditor, fix the reserve price of the property and may sell the whole or any part of such immovable asset by any of the methods. One is by obtaining quotations from persons dealing with similar secured assets or otherwise interested in buying the assets, by inviting tenders, by holding a public auction, including an e-auction mode, and fourth by private realty. So these are the 4 methods of a sale of a property that is usually considered in the Act. And then provided for the sale of an immovable property in state of Jammu and Kashmir, I think we could ignore that and go forward. The authorized officer shall serve to the borrower a notice of 30 days for sale of the immovable secured assets under subsection 5. Thereafter, the next is provided if the sale of such secured asset is being effected by inviting tenders from public or by public auction, the secured creditor shall cause a public notice in the form given in Appendix 4A to be published in 2 leading newspapers, including one in vernacular language, having wide circulation in the locality. So here, there has to be an auction notice, and the auction notice has to be served. There has to be a 30-day sale notice, and then it has to be published in papers if the auction is going to be by way of a public auction, and it also has to be. Then the next one would come, Rule 8.7. Every notice of sale shall be affixed on a conspicuous part of the immovable property, and the authorized officer shall upload the terms and conditions of the sale on the website of the secured creditor, which shall include here. This is again a very important part of the rules. The description of the immovable property to be sold, including the details of the encumbrances, the secured debt for recovery of which the property is to be sold, the reserve price of the immovable secured asset, the time and place of the public auction or the time after which the sale by any other mode shall be completed, the depositing of earnest money as may be stipulated by the secured creditor, and other terms and conditions which the authorized officer will consider it necessary for a purchaser to know. And sale by any other method other than a public auction or by public tender, this is more of, they are talking of a sale by a private realty, shall be on such terms as may be settled between the secured creditor and the proposed purchaser in writing. This is the latest amendment which came up in 2016. Earlier, the Act said that sale which was to be conducted by private realty had to be settled in terms between the parties. So by parties, there used to be the bank, the borrower and the purchaser. But now the borrower has been sent out, and here now we see that the terms will have to be settled only between a secured creditor, which is the bank, and the proposed purchaser. Thereafter, we will now go to Rule 9. This is with respect to the modalities of the sale. Now, no sale of immovable property under these rules in first instance shall take place before the expiry of 30 days from the date on which the public notice of sale is published in the newspapers, as referred to in the proviso to sub-rule 6 of Rule 8, or the notice of sale has been served to the borrower. Provided that if sale by any one of the methods specified under sub-rule 5 of Rule 8 fails, and the sale is required to be conducted again, the authorized officer shall serve, affix and publish notice of sale of not less than 15 days to the borrower for any subsequent. This is a very recent amendment. Earlier, it used to be only a 30-day sale notice. So even if a sale failed for the first time, second time also there had to be a 30-day sale notice. But now we have only a 15-day sale notice in place. The next was Rule 9.2. The sale shall be confirmed in favor of the purchaser who has offered the highest sale price in his bid or tender or quotation or offer to the authorized officer, and shall be subject to confirmation by the secured creditor, provided that no sale shall be confirmed if the amount offered by sale price is less than the reserve price specified under sub-rule 5 of Rule 8. And then the next one. Provided further, if the authorized officer fails to obtain a price higher than the reserve price, he may, with the consent of the borrower and the secured creditor, effect the sale at such price, which means when the authorized officer wants to reduce the price of a property for which he has not been able to find a purchaser at the reserve price at which he had quoted, the consent of the borrower for such reduction of price is very much essential. And then now we go on to Rule 19. On every sale of the immovable property, the purchaser shall immediately, that is on the same day or not later than the next working day as the case may be, pay a deposit of 25% of the amount of the sale price, which is inclusive of the earnest money deposited, if any, to the authorized officer conducting the sale. Under default of such deposit, the property shall be sold again. Then we come to the balance amount. The balance amount payable shall be paid by the purchaser to the authorized officer on or before the 15th day of confirmation of sale of the immovable property, for such extended period as may be agreed upon in writing between the purchaser and the secured creditor, in any case not exceeding 3 months. Now here also Rule 9.3 and 9.4 have been amended. here, as far as Rule 3 is concerned, 9.3 is concerned, earlier, the time given to a purchaser of a property was that he had to pay the earnest money and the deposit of 25% on the same day in which the auction was knocked in his favor. But now here, there is an amendment where they have added that he could either deposit it on the same day or not later than the next working day. So this is how the Act has evolved, taking into consideration the genuine difficulties that could have also been faced by auction purchasers. Now coming to Rule 9.4, here it speaks about the balance amount that is payable. Earlier, the Act gave only a time of 15 days to be paid by a purchaser to an authorized officer towards the balance amount of the purchase price. But now here I find that the recent amendment is that there has been an extended time of 3 months that could be granted to a borrower by the secured creditor. Please note, it is not the authorized officer who is entitled to grant this time extension. It is the secured creditor or the bank who can give 3 months time extension for a successful bidder to pay the balance sale consideration. Then we get to Rule 5, 9.5. In default of the payment within the period mentioned in Sub-Rule 4, the deposit shall be forfeited and the property shall be resold, and the defaulting purchaser shall forfeit all claim to the property or to any part of the sum for which it may be subsequently sold. This is one thing that has always been happening. Here and there, we find that auction purchasers would have defaulted in payment and the amounts would be forfeited. A very interesting question that used to be coming up regularly in the High Court was that the borrowers used to demand that these forfeited amount had to be deposited to their borrower accounts because it was with respect to their properties that were auctioned. But however, that did not find favor with the courts. These monies which have been forfeited have always been deposited into the profit and loss account of the bank, and it is held that the banks are entitled to this forfeited deposits, and it never gets into the accounts of the borrowers. Then, Rule 9.6. On confirmation of sale by the secured creditor, and if the terms of payment have been complied with, the authorized officer exercising the power of sale shall execute a certificate of sale of the immovable property in favor of the purchaser in the form given in Appendix 5 to these rules. Therefore, thereafter, a sale notice is issued. And then, where the immovable property sold is subject to any encumbrances, the authorized officer may, if he thinks fit, allow the purchaser to deposit with him the money required to discharge the encumbrances and any interest due thereon together with such additional amount that may be sufficient to meet the contingencies or further cost. So where a property is sold with encumbrances, then the authorized officer can always take money from the purchaser to discharge the encumbrances, provided that after meeting the cost of removing encumbrances and contingencies, there is any surplus available out of the money deposited by the purchaser, that shall be paid back to the purchaser within 15 days from the date of finalization of sale. Now, after that, we get to this. Rule 9.8. On such deposit of money for discharge of the encumbrances, the authorized officer shall issue or cause the purchaser to issue notices to the persons interested in or entitled to the money deposited with him and take steps to make the payment accordingly. Then the authorized officer shall deliver the property to the purchaser free from encumbrances known to the secured creditor on deposit of money as specified in Sub-Rule 7 above. So here, Rule 9.9 is very important because here it says that irrespective of, though the rule is worded as if the authorized officer shall deliver the property to a purchaser free from encumbrances known to the secured creditor on deposit of money, it also entails a duty on the part of the authorized officer to deliver properties that are being brought for sale by the authorized officer free from encumbrances. That is a duty that is being cast on an authorized officer. Then Rule 9.10, the certificate of sale issued under Sub-Rule 6 shall specifically mention that whether the purchaser had purchased the immovable property asset free from any encumbrances known to the secured creditor or not. So this section only, this Rule 9.10 only reiterates what is said in Rule 9.9. So this brings us to the, so we have now looked into the various provisions of the Act so far. Now let us get on to how the law evolved. So when any action is taken under a SAFESI Act, either on the part of the banks or even on the part of the borrowers, if we would be defending the bank or the borrowers, there is one cardinal principle that needs to be borne in mind. This is a statute that intends, or rather that empowers a quasi-judicial authority to divest people out of their properties without an intervention by the court. That being the case, it is a special statute, and when a statute prescribes something to be done in a particular way, it shall be done only in that way or not at all. This is a basic principle that must be borne in mind when this statute is looked upon and interpreted. So now I will take you to the various judgments that had evolved. So we all know Article 300A of the Constitution of India has always said that the right to property may not be a fundamental right, but it is a constitutional right, and it is also a human right. This proposition has been reiterated by our High Courts and Supreme Courts in several judgments, even under the SFAC Act, time and time again, where they have stressed that the properties that are being handled by an authorized officer are basically the subject matter where a borrower has a right. He has a right to property. It is a constitutional right that is being handled upon. It is a human right that is being handled upon. And therefore, the procedures that are enunciated under the Act must be strictly adhered to. So it is with that outlook that we will have to get into the Act. Now, there is also a legal maxim to that effect. Expressio unius est, exclusio ulterius. So when a statute requires something to be done in a particular way, it shall be done only in that way and or not at all. This has also been again and again consistently reiterated by several judgments. Now getting to the 13.2, I will now start going through the various procedures that are enumerated under the Act. 13.2, issuance of a demand notice. The Act is set into motion by issuing a demand notice. When a demand notice is issued, it is a show cause notice. A demand notice necessarily needs to contain a few particulars. The first that it must contain is the date on which the account has turned to an NPA, the loans that have been availed by a borrower, the interest rates that have been charged by the bank, the amount outstanding in the account of the borrower, and also the details of the secured assets that are sought to be enforced by the bank. It should also contain a description of the property. This notice shall also very clearly give 60 days time to a borrower to settle his dues. If a demand notice is found lacking in any one of these criteria, it would be construed as a defective notice. Now, Section 13.2 demand notice is mandatorily to be served on a borrower. The modes of service could be by way of an RPAD, or it could be served by way of hand delivery, or these days even by an email. One more thing that needs to be looked into while service of a demand notice is it should be served on the borrower or the guarantors. And if it is to be served on somebody else other than a borrower, the person who receives a notice on behalf of a borrower must be authorized by him. This is very, very clearly laid in the rules. Now let us get to a few judgments on that. Non-service of demand notice. When a demand notice is not served and subsequent actions are being taken by the authorized officer in pursuance of such demand notice, what happens to the further actions that are taken on the basis of a demand notice which is found to be defective? Now, a non-service of a demand notice, the actions that would follow is very clearly laid in a legal maxim, sub lato fundamento cadit opus. If the foundation is removed, the superstructure falls. Therefore, the foundation of any action under the SFAC Act would only rise with a demand notice, which is to be scrupulously served on a borrower, and all provisions and all the rules, those rules you could find in Rule 5 in the SFAC Act. Rule 5 has to be scrupulously followed. Now, the question of non-service of a demand notice and various kinds of infirmities that were found in the exercise of a notice under the caption of a 13.2 notice was discussed by our High Court In 2010 5 CTC 419, Sheba Philomena Merlin versus the Repo Bank. It's a very interesting judgment where the court opened up the judgment using the words misuse and abuse. Here is a case where the borrower passed away even 3 years before a demand notice could be issued. The bank then wants to bring the property for sale and serves notice not on the legal heirs, not on the last known address, but on some other person who is wholly unconnected with the matter, and then thereafter brought the property for sale and also proceeded to sell the property and realized amounts. In the course of the hearing of the writ petition, I found that the court had also found that bids had been tampered. So the court went on to hold from para 31, court went on to hold that a statutory provision which is as important as delivering a demand notice and which finally entails in a sale of a property must be scrupulously followed. I will read from para 31 onwards. The security interest enforcement rules have been framed under the powers conferred by subsection 1 and clause B2 of subsection 2 of section 38, read with subsections 4, 10 and 12 of section 13 of the SARFAESI Act. And the said rules are subordinate legislation and they have force on the statute. So the rules which lay down the procedure for service of a demand notice is very important and they have the force of a statute. So it has been held by the Apex Court in Tamil Nadu Electricity versus Status Spinning Mills, reported in 2008, 7 SEC 353, that if subordinate legislations validly made may have to be read in the same manner as if it is a part of the Act. Therefore, it cannot be said that the rules will not have as much of force as the Act. That is what the section says there. And then the court went on to hold that it is very rudimentary, rather elementary, that for an action under the SARFAESI Act, issuance and service of notice under section 13.2 and 13.4 is mandatory. So this judgment did not only speak of section 13.2, it also spoke of section 13.4. The bank which is armed with enormous powers under the Act to deal with a secured asset should have gone by the Act and not in contravention of the Act. So that was the observation of the Honorable High Court in Sheba Merlin's case, and thereafter the auction was set aside. And in fact, a CBCID inquiry was ordered against the officials of the bank for the various disparities that were committed while handling this account. Now then we get on to section 13.3a. So a notice under section 13.2 does not entail a borrower to approach a court of law at that stage. It does not give rise to a cause of action. The only remedy or the only recourse that is available to a borrower at that point of time would be the issuance of a notice under section 13.3a. Under section 13.3a, a borrower can very well write to the authorized officer detailing the objections for the demand notice that had been served on him. And it is mandatory. It is mandatory for the authorized officer to reply to such objections received by him within 15 days of the receipt of such notice. In fact, if there is a failure on the part of an authorized officer to reply to the objections made under section 13.3a, that is again a statutory violation, and all actions that would thereafter follow after issuance of the 13.3a would be rendered null and void. Here we have a fantastic judgment of our Supreme Court, which has been made by our sitting Chief Justice of India. It is ITC Limited versus Blue Coast Hotels Limited and others. I will read it is 2018, 15 SEC 99. Here, the court went on to discuss in detail about the non-compliance of the provisions under section 13.3a, more clearly from paragraph number 28. I'll read out. We find the language of subsection 3a to be clearly impulsive. It states that the secured creditor shall consider. It did not say may consider. The Act says shall consider. The court has also given it here. Shall consider such representations or objections And further, if such representation or objection is not acceptable or obtainable, he shall communicate the reasons for non-acceptance thereof. We see no reason to marginalize or dilute the impact of the use of imperative shall by reading it as may. The word shall invariably raises a presumption that the particular provision is imperative. And then the court went on to say, there is nothing in the legislative scheme of section 13(3)(a) which requires the court to consider whether or not the word shall is to be treated as directory in the provision. Now this section, this particular judgment, though it deals only with a non-compliance of section 13(3)(a), also goes on to discuss about the usage of the word shall in the act. So wherever the act uses the word shall, it is construed to be mandatory. It is not merely directory. So here it goes on. The word shall is to be treated as directory in the provision. As the section stood originally, there was no provision for the above mentioned requirement of a debtor to make a representation or raise an objection to the notice issued by the creditor under section 13(2). As it was introduced via subsection 3(a), it could not be the intention of the Parliament for the provision to be futile and for the discretion to ignore the objection, representation, and proceed to take measures be left with the creditor. Thereafter, para 30. So this provision provides for communication of the reasons for not accepting the representations on the objections and the requirement to furnish reasons for not accepting. A provision which requires reasons to be furnished must be considered as mandatory. So that seals the question on the necessity to reply under section 13(3)(a). Such a provision is an integral part of the duty to act fairly and reasonably and not fancifully. So we are not prepared to interpret the silence of the Parliament in not providing for any consequence for non-compliance with the duty to furnish reasons. The provisions must nonetheless be treated as mandatory. Very interestingly, in paragraph 31, the court went on to observe a single line which I find very interesting. Because on and off in the Securitization Act, when arguments are put forth in the court, generally the banks come up with a consistent plea that there is no prejudice that is caused. Or they would always come and say that the debtor does not deserve this kind of a treatment from the court because he had not been paying the monies, or that he had been dragging the issues, or that he had been very recalcitrant. But here there is a line that I find in paragraph 31 of this judgment where they say, however, we are of the view that the construction of the act should not be affected by the facts of a particular case. So in any way, when suppose a question is posed, where we would be asked that whether the debtor deserves to be shown leniency because of the non-compliance of a statutory provision, yes, he does require, he does deserve that, because the act, the provisions under the act are mandatory, irrespective of the conduct of a debtor. And prejudice should not be cast. Prejudice can never be taken as a ground for saying that there was no prejudice on the part of the debtor, because it is for an authority who wields power under a statute giving him enormous powers to act without prejudice, or irrespective of whether there is prejudice or not. It is his duty to be complying with the provisions of the act. So that was ITC hotels. Thereafter, we get on to section 13(4). Section 13(4) deals with possession of the properties. So when a bank takes possession of the property, it does it by preparing a possession notice as nearly as possible to Appendix 4. The possession notice is then served on the borrower by any of the means, such as an RPAD or by hand delivery, or these days even sometimes by email. Also, the possession notice is to be pasted in a conspicuous part of the property, and publication of the possession notice is mandatory in one English daily and in one vernacular daily. The question of whether a publication of a possession notice in a vernacular daily in English came to be decided before the Orissa High Court in AR 2009 Orissa 147. This judgment is one of the finest judgments that we could see in the SARFAESI Act, and it holds value even today. The judgment has dealt in depth with the various aspects of a sale or the various aspects of procedures that are generally followed by an authorized officer. Though the crux of the matter that came to be decided by this judgment was whether a vernacular publication could be done in English in a vernacular day. The court here went on to hold that a vernacular publication is basically done for the purpose of the illiterate and the normal people also to know that a property has fallen into the possession of a bank of an authorized officer and that it could be brought for sale shortly, and so that there is a large number of bidders and it gets the widest publicity. So this is the purpose of a vernacular publication. Here the court held that where there is no publication of a possession notice as mandated in vernacular language in a vernacular daily, then there is a discrepancy and there has been not that the act has not been followed. There has been a statutory violation and the auction was set aside. Now, this judgment also interestingly went on to hold several other propositions. So, para 66 onwards, the judgment dealt with a wide import. I have, however, shortened it and informed this about as to what is the compliance for publication in a vernacular daily. This was again reiterated by our Madras High Court in an unreported judgment of Padmavati versus the authorized officer Dhanalakshmi Bank. In Padmavati versus the authorized officer Dhanalakshmi Bank, an auction was challenged. And of the several discrepancies that were laid before the court, there was also this one particular submission that the vernacular, the possession notice had not been published in a vernacular language in a vernacular daily, and also there an additional point of circulation was taken. The court there in Padmavati versus the authorized officer went on to hold that the widest circulation had to be given, the publications of a possession notice, either in an English daily or in a vernacular daily, had to be necessarily done in a newspaper having the widest circulation. In that case, the court on its own accord had elucidated the circulations of the various papers that were available throughout Tamil Nadu and found that the publication had been done in a vernacular paper which did not have wide publicity. So the court found that there had been indeed a statutory violation in not publishing the possession notice in a vernacular daily having sufficient circulation in the locality. So that was for section 13. Thereafter now, the non-service of a possession notice, we had already seen in the judgment of Philomena Shiba, which was the Madras High Court's judgment earlier, where it held that it is statutory, it is mandatory on the part of the authorized officer to serve both the demand notice and the possession notice. Now, paper publication of the possession notice in an English daily in English and vernacular language in a vernacular daily was settled by the judgment of the Orissa High Court in Swastik. And that it had to be having a wide publicity was also laid down by the Madras High Court in Padmavati Ammal versus the authorized officer. Now, thereafter, getting on 13.4, after this portion of 13.4, we come to the sale notice. Rule 8 and Rule 9, I will now get on to the rules. Rule 8. So, Rule 8.5 onwards starts with the various procedures that are to be followed by an authorized officer for sale of a property. So it reads like this. Before effecting a sale of an immovable property, the authorized officer shall obtain a valuation of the property from an approved valuer and in consultation with a secured creditor, fix the reserve price of the property and may sell the whole or any part of such immovable assets by any of the following methods. So what is mandated here under this rule is, even before a property is being thought of being to be sold, the first step that an authorized officer must take is to obtain a valuation of the properties. And it is these days, most of the banks take not one but two valuation reports, because valuation of a property, undervaluation of a property is always a ground that is available to a borrower to agitate before a tribunal. It is also mandatory on the part of an authorized officer to fix a fair value for the property that is sought to be sold. So the procedure is like this. A valuation has to be obtained from a valuer. The valuer has to be an approved valuer as per the Wealth Tax Act. And the authorized officer then not thereafter individually go and fix an upset price for the property. He has to consult the secured creditor. If there is no records to show that a secured creditor was consulted for the purpose of fixing a reserve price of the property, the auction can be set aside. Therefore, those portions are very important. So fix the reserve price of the property and may sell the whole or any part thereof. The Supreme Court has reiterated again and again that where it is essential to sell the whole property, it should be sold. But for a debt, if a portion of a property could be severable and sold, then that option must always be exercised by an authorized officer. So there are four ways by which a property can be sold. One is by getting sealed tenders. The next is by obtaining quotations, which is rarely used. The third is by a public auction, and the fourth is by a private clearing. Now, the authorized officer shall thereafter serve to the borrower a notice of 30 days for sale of the immovable secured assets under sub-rule 5. Now, coming here to the judgments in valuation. Now, here we have just seen how the authorized officer is supposed to obtain a valuation of the property. I find here a judgment of the Supreme Court, which I was not able to get the citation. I'll just give the cause title. SJS Business Enterprises versus State of Bihar. Here, though this was a judgment that arose out of a State Financial Corporation Act, the court went on to say that there were three valuations that were obtained by the financial corporation there in a span of 8 months before the property was sold, and there was a regular step downing of the valuation of the property. In the course of our practice, we would always see that the property values would be reduced with each auction. There would be a step-by-step reduction of the valuation of the property within a very short period. That step-by-step reduction in the valuation of the property was frowned on by the Supreme Court in this judgment. Thereafter, we then get on to the judgment of Anil Kumar Srivatsava. Here, the court spoke on what was an upset price and what could be a valuation. The difference between the valuation of a property and what was an upset price of the property was discussed in this judgment. 2004 8 SCC 671. Here, in paragraph 11, the court went on to discuss the concept of a valuation of a property and the upset or a reserve price of a property. It went on to say this. In the case of McManus versus Fortescue and another, reported in 1907, so it was then that the law had evolved. It had been held by the Court of Appeal that in a sale by auction subject to reserve, every offer or bid and its acceptance is conditional. That the public is informed by the fact that the sale is subject to a reserve, that the auctioneer has agreed to sell for the amount which the bidder is prepared to give, only in case that amount is equal to or higher than the reserve. That the reserve puts a limit on the authority of the auctioneer. So the purpose of fixing an upset price under the Act is only to put a hold on the authorized officer so that he would not go below the upset price that is fixed. This is the reason why there is an upset price that is fixed. So it puts a reserve on the authority of the auctioneer. He cannot accept a price below the upset price. He could refuse a bid which is below the upset price. The SARFAESI Act mandates that where the price offered is below the upset price, the authorized officer could not accept the bid. Then para 12, the aforestated ruling explains the meaning of the term reserve price. It indicates the object behind fixing the reserve price, that is to limit the authority of the auctioneer, in this case the authorized officer. In the present case, the board resolution is meant to guide the officers of the second respondent. The resolution prescribes the guideline for fixing the reserve price. The concept of reserve price is not synonymous with the valuation of the property. upset price is different, evaluation of the property is different. These two terms operate in different spheres. An invitation to tender is not an offer. It is an attempt to ascertain whether an offer can be obtained with a margin. Now the court went on to discuss about valuation. Valuation is a question of fact. This court is reluctant to interfere where valuation is based on relevant material. The difference between a valuation and an upset price had been explained in the case of B. Sushila and Aneta versus Saraswati Ammal. That's a 1970 judgment in which it had been held that fixation of an upset price may be an indication of the probable price which the land may fetch from the point of view of intending bidders. Therefore, it is very clear that an upset price need not be synonymous with the valuation of the property. The value of the property could be much different from what is here as what is mentioned as an upset price of the property. However, notwithstanding the fixation of upset price and notwithstanding the fact that a bidder has offered an amount higher than the upset price, the sale is still open to challenge on the ground that a property had not fetched a proper price and the sale be set aside. So where auctions are usually impugned on grounds of undervaluation, the usual replies that would be emanating would be that the upset price had been fixed in consultation of by the authorized officer in consultation with the secured creditor on obtention of a valuation report, and therefore it could not be questioned. This judgment sets at rest that notion and says that an upset price is different from a valuation of the property, and upset price irrespective of whether there has been an upset price and irrespective of whatever the offers could have been after the upset price was fixed, it is always open to a borrower to challenge undervaluation of a property. The price has to commence at a higher price, and in absence, the price will have to be progressively brought down till it reaches the upset price. So this is the purpose of an upset price being fixed, and this is how an valuation of the property is completely different from an upset price of the property. And irrespective of the valuation of the upset prices that have been fixed, valuation is always a subject that can be agitated upon. Thereafter, we go to the next. This is again a landmark judgment of the Supreme Court to which I would go next. This is on a 30-day notice of a sale notice that requires to be served on the borrower. It's a very famous judgment, the landmark judgment, Matthew Varghese versus Amrita Kumar, which has thereafter been followed in umpteen judgments of the several high courts as well as the subsequent judgments of the Supreme Court also. So in this matter, the court went on to hold that where a sale notice is issued to a borrower, there has to be very clearly 30 days notice before the auction or the sale of a property can be held by an authorized officer. This judgment also made it clear that 30 days notice had to be completed, not only from the receipt of a sale notice by the borrower, but also from publication of the sale notice by the bank in a daily, and in the absence of that, the auction would be vitiated. This judgment also interestingly spoke on a right of redemption of the borrower. At para 34, it held the right of redemption, which is embodied in section 60 of the Transfer of Property Act, is available to a mortgagor until it has been extinguished by the act of parties. The combined effect of section 54 of the Transfer of Property Act and section 17 of the Indian Registration Act is that a contract for sale in respect of an immovable property of the value of more than 100 rupees without registration cannot extinguish the equity of redemption. So what generally happens is that once an auction takes place, usually it is said that there has been a confirmation of sale and the borrower has lost his right of redemption. That, according to my opinion, may not be true. As long as the sale certificate is registered, your borrower never loses his right of redemption. In fact, now the latest amendment that has been done under section 13(8), wherein the right of redemption is available to a borrower until the publication of the sale notice, also thereafter contains one more clause by which it says, actions taken until the completion of various actions that are taken by an authorized officer in pursuance of a notice under section 13(4), the borrower has got a right to redeem his property. This judgment also set at rest an earlier judgment of the Madras High Court, which was passed in the matter called Chakina, where it held that once a sale certificate, once a sale was knocked in favor of an auction purchaser, the borrower had lost his right of redemption. There, the Supreme Court went on to hold that until registration of a sale certificate, the right to redeem would accrue. But once a sale certificate is registered, the right of redemption thereafter gets extinguished. But however, of course, if an auction is challenged and is set aside, the right to redemption then comes alive again. We would then go on to the next judgment. This is a judgment, unreported judgment of the Madras High Court, which was passed by Justice P.K. Mishra, M. Chokalingam versus the Authorized Officer, Indian Bank. Here, the interpretation of what would be the contents of a sale notice came to be agitated before the High Court. Here, the borrower, after the issuance of a sale notice, in the process of litigation, had made several payments. But however, ultimately, when a sale notice was issued by the bank, it did not give credit to any of the various payments that were made by the borrower. An interpretation was taken before the court, where it said that a sale notice shall contain particulars of the debt that is due from the borrower as on the date of the sale notice. So the definition of debt is not found in the Securitization Act. For that, we fall back on the RBDFI Act. And even under the RBDFI Act, a debt is defined as an amount which is due and payable from the borrower to the bank. So coupling both together, a sale notice has to necessarily contain the amount due from the borrower which is payable to the bank as on the date of the sale notice. Several times, banks would be issuing sale notice where the amount which has been mentioned in the demand notice would be found as the amount due with subsequent interest. It's a usual thing that is being done. But here, this judgment specifically said, it laid down the law that the amount which is mentioned in the sale notice has to be essentially that it had to reflect the amount outstanding on the date when the sale notice was issued. Now, going on to the next judgment, this is with respect to the, thereafter we come to the next portion where an auction is being held and the EMDs are being invited. This is also an unreported judgment of the Madras High Court. Mrs. Lakshmi Mogan versus Mrs. Artec Project Engineers. It was passed in the year 2013. Here, the property was brought for sale for an upset price of 2.5 crores. An EMD of 10% had to be paid. Sorry, it was, yes, an EMD of 10% had to be paid. So the EMD amount here had to be 21 lakhs and 50,000. The bidders here had paid only an EMD of 21 lakhs and 15,000. There was a shortage of 35,000. Though the bank did try to raise a point that it could not render the auction infructuous, the court went on to hold, though it held various other arguments in favor of the bank, went on to hold that where an EMD is required to be 10% of the upset price, any deviation from this mandatory procedure would render the auction null and void and set aside the auction. Thereafter, we would come to a judgment of my senior. This is a judgment which my learned senior had appeared and argued in the High Court of Madras and which holds good until today. Here, an authorized officer of the bank had brought the property for sale, which was not sold. Subsequently, without the consent of the borrower, the authorized officer had sold the property for a lesser price. That act of the authorized officer came to be impugned before the High Court. And here, the court went on to hold that the rules under the Securitization Act are very clear that an authorized officer cannot accept a reserve price which is lesser than the reserve price. Rather, it is worded otherwise. It also says that an authorized officer can confirm a bid only if it is higher than the upset price. So, where a price is offered which is less than the reserve price, if the consent of the borrower is obtained for such amount, then the sale can be confirmed. If the authorized officer fails to obtain a price which is higher than the upset price, or even obtains a price which is equal to the reserve price, the auction cannot be conducted and it would suffer from an infirmity. This particular provision of law has still not been amended. I have found that over a period of time, with several judgments falling to the credit of the SARFAESI Act, where several provisions and rules had been interpreted by the High Court, the legislature had also been making changes to suit, or rather to plug the loopholes that were found in the Act. But this particular rule of under Rule 9 of the SARFAESI Act remains untouched. It has not been touched until date. So that was Ramaselvam's judgment. And then thereafter, now there is a new section. I will also now go to the latest amendments that have been made. So we have gone on 30 days notice, and then the affixure of the sale notice. We have also discussed about the various provisions, or rather the various necessities that are to be found in a sale notice, the whatever has to be constitute a sale notice. And then no sale of the, we have also discussed about Rule 9, where it says that a sale of property, no sale of an immobile property shall take place before the expiry of 30 days from which from the date on which the public notice of sale is published in newspapers, as referred to in proviso to sub Rule 6 of Rule 8. And then if the, here again, provided further that if sale of an immovable property by any one of the methods specified by sub Rule 5 of Rule 8 fails, and the sale is required to be conducted again, the authorized officer shall serve, affix and publish a notice of sale of not less than 15 days to the borrower for any subsequent sale. Now here there was an interpretation that came up. Now for instance, the bank decides not to proceed with the sale after a 30-day notice and calls back the sale notice. Then when it wants to sell the property again, can the bank issue a mere 15-day notice, or whether it is mandatory for it to give a 30-day notice? The wordings of the rule make it very clear that only if the sale of an immobile property, which is specified under Rule 8.5 fails. So for an auction to fail, it has to be taken up for auction, and in the absence of a bidder, or in the absence of it, only in the absence of a bidder, the auction fails. Only in that event, the bank would be entitled to bring it back again for sale with a 15-day sale notice. If for any reason the auction had been called off by the bank itself, or if a stay had been obtained by a borrower before the DRT under the provisions of the securitization and under section 17(1), then the bank would not be entitled to use this provision. Then the sale shall be confirmed in favor of the purchaser who has offered the highest sale price. We had also gone through that. And then where we have also gone through Rule 8.9.2, where it says that the authorized officer fails to obtain a price higher than the reserve price, he may, with the consent of the borrower and the secured creditor, effect the sale at such price. We have gone through that also. Then this deposit of 25% also we had just gone through the judgment of Justice Chitra Venkatraman. And then the balance price, here again it is the balance price of purchase money, Rule 9.4, shall be paid by the purchaser to the authorized officer on or before the 15th day of confirmation of sale of the immovable property, or such extended period as may be agreed upon in writing between the purchaser and the secured creditor, in any case not exceeding 3 months. Now this rule is a very interesting rule because it is comparatively a new one, and it also has a catch. Now the authorized officer, when he issues a sale notice, always mandates that a payment must be made within the 15 days after the sale is knocked in his favor. If for some reason the bidder is not able to make a payment, then the bidder has to approach the secured creditor. It does not, the provision here does not talk of an authorized officer. The authorized officer becomes functus officio once the sale is done, as far as extension of time for payment is concerned. So the bidder thereafter has to approach the secured creditor for a time extension, and the secured creditor can extend the time up to 3 months. So notwithstanding a term in the sale notice by the authorized officer giving 15 days time for payment of the balance money, it is open to a secured creditor to offer 3 months time extension for a bidder to make the payment. But however, interestingly, there has been a latest judgment of the Kerala High Court. This is an unreported judgment again, Shibu versus Tamil Nadu Mercantile Bank. It's a latest judgment which was passed on 12th August 2020. Here the court said that while the Act has provided time for the balance payment to be made within 3 months, the statute itself provides only for 3 months for the balance payment, and the secured creditor cannot extend the payment for the balance consideration beyond 3 months. So that was the interpretation for section 9.4. Then thereafter 9. Rule 9.5 says that in the default of the payment within the period mentioned, the deposit shall be forfeited by the bank. So here also I said that in case of such forfeiture, it always goes to the profit or loss accounts of the bank. It is not credited to the account of the borrower, and that is how it has been working, and it has been upheld by the courts also. Then comes section 9, rule 9.6. On confirmation of a sale by the secured creditor, and if the terms of payments have been complied with, the authorized officer exercising the power of sale shall issue a certificate of sale of an immovable property in the form given in Appendix 6. So on the payment received, the authorized officer thereafter executes a sale certificate. Then here comes the tricky part, where the immovable property is sold subject to any encumbrances. The authorized officer, if he thinks fit, shall allow the purchaser to deposit with him the money required to discharge the encumbrances and any interest due thereon. And thereafter, it should also be read with Rule 9.8, where it says, on deposit of such money for discharge of the encumbrances, the authorized officer shall issue or cause the purchaser to issue notices to persons interested in or entitled to the money deposited with him and take steps to make the payment. The authorized officer shall deliver the property to the purchaser free from encumbrances known to the secured creditor on deposit of money as specified in subsection 7. Now, a consistent plea that would be put by banks when properties are sold under auction is that where they have not divulged the earlier attachments or any kind of encumbrances that would be there in the property is that the usage of the word assis veris and assis votis. Assis veris and assis votis is very different from what is an encumbrance over the property. Even assuming that the bank, even if the bank is going to be issuing a sale notice with an assis veris or an assis votis condition, by virtue of these rules, the bank is mandated to disclose all encumbrances in its sale notice so that the purchaser can take a calculated move on whether he wants to purchase the property or not. Failure to inform the encumbrances in a sale notice will always result in the auction being set aside, and the auction purchaser will have to be compensated back with the money. This has also been laid by several judgments of our High Court. Thereafter, now I come to the sale by private realty. This is a very interesting piece of law which has now come. This is something that I wanted to dwell upon. Earlier, our Supreme Court had held in the judgment of Rajiv Subramaniam versus Pandyas that where a bank wants to sell a property by a private realty, the terms of sale would have to be decided between the parties in writing. So earlier, the parties in writing constituted the bank, the borrower, and the purchaser. Now that rule had been amended, and where it said the terms between the secured creditor and the purchaser. So I was wondering as to why such an section or such a rule could even be in place where a borrower could be deprived of his property without him even knowing what was happening, or rather it would be more like it would be happening behind his back. And then I am now recently told by my senior that there has been a judgment. I have not set my eyes on it though, but I am being told that there is a recent judgment which says that even when there is a sale by a private realty, the sale notice has to be published by the bank. The publication of the sale notice also has to be published. The sale notice has to be served on the borrower. It also has to be affixed. And only then a sale by a private realty can be reduced to terms between a bank and a bidder. So therefore, this judgment of Rajiv Subramaniam, though it has worked itself out, is still now protected by virtue of another judgment, of course, which I have not yet set my eyes on it, but probably then I will share it with Vikas if I get it. Now, coming to section 13.5, this is also another judgment that has just caught my eye. Section 13.5 of the Act is also a very recent enactment. And here, the section says that where a bank is unable to sell a property for the reserve price as mentioned, then it can step into the shoes of a bidder and can purchase the properties as if through its authorized representative. This is found in section 13.5. This came to be challenged before the High Court of Madras in 2017 8 MLJ 647, Magudeshwaran versus the authorized officer Lakshmi Vilas Bank. Here, the court said that when a bank wants to purchase a property by stepping into the shoes of a bidder, it has to be treated as if it is a sale under a private realty, and the bank has to take the original borrower, into consideration and take him for a discussion, and there have to be terms that needed to be reduced in writing between them. In the absence of such a provision, the auction, the sale itself deserves to be set aside. And in this case also, the sale was set aside. So this is the provision, or this is the protection which is afforded to a borrower when a bank wants to take over a property. The bank has to put him on notice about it. The bank also has to take him into confidence and inform him about it. There has to be an agreement or at least something in writing between them, reducing the terms of sale, and only then the bank can go forward and purchase the property. So I think with this, we are almost nearing the conclusion of this session. Now, I'll also just inform of one latest position here, where an auction purchaser, this is from the point of view of an auction purchaser who is saddled with the dues. The latest amendment to the RBDFI Act in section 31B very clearly says that the secured creditor shall have priority of its due over any other authority who claims any dues from the secured creditor. So this could apply to sales tax, income tax, and various other demands that have been made over tax dues. But however, whether this would apply to charges that run with the property, like a property tax or an electricity connection, the answer was negated by a very recent judgment of our Supreme Court. I could not lay my hands on that judgment too, but I did read that judgment, which said that charges run with a property in the terms of a property tax, or for that matter, an electricity dues, will have to be borne by an auction purchaser. So I think with that, I have almost come to the conclusion of my preparation. So now back to you, Vikas.
Thank you. As what Mr. Parthasarthi had told, that we will get an insightful session. We are actually enriched by the deeper insights. I will ask my learned friends that they can post the questions, but since it's a Saturday and the festival also on, we will not take much questions, but we will take few limited questions to the effect. One aspect I will just ask before the questions keep on pouring, that invariably in large number of cases you would find that the borrower approaches, let's assume quite a number of people approach through the writ petition, even though there are judgments to the effect that you should first avail the remedy under section 17. Writ is filed, they say that they want to settle for an OTS, that is one-time settlement. And thereafter, at the first brush, they give the payment what is told by the court. And then they do not pay, that is, the entire commitment stands default. Whether there is any provision where we can ask the court that since the possession has been handed over on the asking of the court, that now the possession should be handed over back by the borrower because he has defaulted in terms of the commitment what was originally contemplated. Because otherwise, that entire motion of publication of notice or taking of the possession, asking the SDM, asking the Tahsildar, what is the remedy in that particular case? Because these types of cases, at least in Punjab Haryana High Court, we are finding a team number of cases where the party commits that their payment will be made. The court says hand over the possession back to the borrower, and thereafter there is a default by them, saying that there was COVID-19, etc. Now, what is the remedy according to you? Should you move an application for the restoration of the possession, or is it a contempt, or you will have to start the hands of the clock back?
No, I don't think there would be a case for contempt, but I think you could always file an application asking the court to direct the borrower to hand over the possession back, because possession has been ceded by the bank or by the authorized officer to the borrower only by virtue of an order of the High Court, under which some payment had been done and there is a promise of a further payment. When further payment has not been made, then the court which has ordered, basically a repossession of unsecured asset can be done only by a DRT under the provisions of the Act. But here, if this High Court would have stepped in and ordered for a possession to be given back to the borrower, and the borrower does not keep up his words, then the option that would be available for the bank is to bring it to the notice of the court and ensure that it gets back its possession through the court itself.
Because I found that large number of people do commit and then they buy the time in that process, and ultimately there's a default. It's a common stooge which is being a common process which is being used. It says.
True, very true. But right, we rarely see such matters here. Here, there have been very few instances of the courts asking for possession to be ceded back to the borrower. But if such case has arisen, then yes, you need to go back to the court which passed the order for granting the possession back.
Because invariably, once you say that the auction be stayed and we are willing to make the payment, then the gestation period is around 3 to 4 months. So invariably, in that way, to maintain the balance of equity, courts do say that the possession should be handed over. Because let's assume it's a working institution, working factory or something. Maybe it's an NPA. That eventuality.
Yes, of course. Yes, I would have to agree with that because eventually, at some point of time or other, the properties would have been sold. But there is nothing wrong. I always keep telling even my own banking clients that there is nothing wrong in keep giving opportunities. Because once the property is sold and once it is taken off, then it is never going to vest back in the borrower. So if possession has to be given on a promise, then it is always worth it. He's after all trying to exercise his right of redemption. So that opportunity, even according to me, must be given. In those cases, yes, leniency must be practiced.
The next question would be, like we have been doing an auction part. I would just ask you to share the knowledge, the judgment of that Justice Chauhan, wherein it says that how that property is to be sold. Let's assume the property is worth 5 crores and only recovery part is 1 crore. What is the procedure laid down in that particular judgment? Could you just share your insights to that effect? Whether you will share the entire property or whether you will ask a particular part of the property which can be sold off to set off the total amount.
No, in those cases, generally, even as per you're talking of the judgment of the Odisha High Court in Swastik.
Yes.
Yes. In Swastik packaging. There also the court had deeply gone into the question of whether a property had to be necessarily sold in a whole or whether it was sufficient if a part of the property was enough to satisfy the dues. So where a part of the property is enough to satisfy the dues, the value of the property would be 5 crores, the outstanding is only 1 crore, then every effort must be made by the authorized officer to demarcate a portion of the property that would be sufficient to satisfy the dues, and only those portions of the property must be brought for sale. It is also available in the Act also. The Act also provides that the authorized officer may sell a part or the whole of the property. So it is for the authorized officer to apply his mind and see that only the portion of the property necessary for realizing the debt should be sold. If there is a flouting of that particular section, then it is very well under, it is open to the borrower to challenge it.
Could you enlighten us as to how to fix the security on the movable properties when involved in some crime? Secondly, how to fulfill the financer had the movable property been hypothecated? What should be the security in the event of interim release?
Can you repeat that question?
It is, could you please enlighten us as to how the security on a movable properties when involved in some crime? Secondly, how to fulfill the financer at the movable property been hypothecated? What should be done? What should be the security in the event of the interim release?
What should be the security
in the event of interim release? Probably wants to say that the let's assume the court says that you release this hypothetical property, then how to safeguard the interest of that hypothetical property? Probably because
hypothecated property is actually the position of law there is very different. Hypothecated properties are a floating charge. Now there are different types of hypothecated properties. Hypotheca could be stocks in use. Hypothecas could be stocks which are raw materials, and also there could be hypothecas which are moving vehicles. So there are different kinds of hypothecas that are available. I think here the question is as to whether the hypotheca of a moving vehicle, is that the question here? If it is going to, if it is going to be a vehicle, then it is open to the authorized officer to seize the vehicle and bring it for sale under the provisions of the Act. Generally, for that, the Securitization Act is rarely used because an hypothecation agreement itself will have an inbuilt clause as to how the vehicle could be seized and sold. In the event that the security is made unavailable, and that is going to be the only security, the only option would be to file a police complaint and try to find out the vehicle. But for that, otherwise, there cannot be much relief, except that probably you could file an OA in the DRT, get a decree and try for arrest or try to identify other securities.
But invariably, though he's not written, the price for an OA will not suffice because the jurisdiction of the, in terms of the money, because invariably the property will not be of worth 20 lakhs.
Yes, it may not be. But of late, I had done a plethora of cases where there were trucks that were hypothecated, that were valued at even more than 20 lakhs, and we got a decree in every one of them. But we were not able to seize a single truck.
In that eventuality, the difficulty is again with the disposing of the property because it is a depreciating product.
Yes.
Each month counts the depreciation.
True.
Whatever you do it after 2 months sale, etc., it depreciates like anything. I also dealt one case where there was a luxury bus. With the flux of time, every time, let's assume there was a stay or something, the prices just shot down.
That's true. You're talking of hypothecas.
Yes, I'm saying that.
Whereas immobile properties, yes, over a period of time, they escalate in value. But hypothecas, yes, they tend to lose value. But if it is going to be a movable property like that of a truck, it is not easy for a borrower to sell it also, because the hypothecation deed will bear the charge of the bank, so that nobody would be easily ready to buy it, unless it is, sold by way of some other method, like removing the plates and then just giving it off for a song or something like that. So that would be the difficulty when a hypotheca involving vehicles is involved. With respect to stocks in trade, where there are raw materials that are in stock or finished goods in stock, once an account becomes an NPA, the stock ceases to exit. It becomes a frozen charge. And it is no more a floating charge, but it is a frozen charge. And it gets merged with the NPA. So there is no question of seizing the stocks and selling. This is actually the position of law, but very few people put it into practice.
Is it compulsory that cooperative banks must follow the SARFAESI Act or the Cooperative Society Act for the sale of property of NPA?
Cooperative societies, I have recently read that the SARFAESI Act has been held applicable to them. But I have to pause for some time and find out and come back on whether they are given the option to select between the two acts. Probably they would.
Probably doctrine of election can apply.
Sorry?
I think doctrine of election would apply when the Supreme Court judgment had upheld the SARFAESI Act, if you remember, in 2010. Then they held that the institution is well within its right to proceed within the whether doctrine of election or simultaneously also. Then they said you can move simultaneously. Yes. Moving with the OA plus SA would be done. Here probably doctrine of election would come into vogue.
Yeah, probably here too the doctrine of election could come into role. So maybe it is open for them to elect either between the SARFAESI Act or whether their Cooperative Societies Act.
This is, should a second charge holder approach writ court or DRT, wherein the nationalized bank being the first charge holder sells off the charge property and the borrower is now a wound up company?
The second charge holder has to approach the DRT because that is where the adjudication of the debt is happening, and that is from where the realization would be coming. So it is open for him to approach the DRT and not the writ court. The factum of existence of the second charge and the rights that could follow under the second charge are all facts which need to be proved. And the writ court is not a court of facts. Therefore, they always would have to go before the DRT and not the writ court.
If there is an income tax due on a property secured, given priority on property, how to proceed further? Hello? Ma'am, you will have to relog, I suppose. Yes. Did you hear the question or should I repeat that question?
I think you have to repeat the question.
Yes. If there is an income tax due on a property secured creditor, given priority on property, how should one proceed?
If there is an income tax due over a secured asset, is right now under the purview of Section 31B of the RBDFI Act, where there has been a very recent amendment which said that the secured creditor will have priority over all these dues. But however, the larger question of law is now pending before the Supreme Court in an appeal. This matter came to be decided by a three-member bench of the Madras High Court, which held that a bank's charge over a property would outweigh that of any tax due that would be claimed on the property. That judgment is now being tested before the Supreme Court and is pending adjudication there. But as of now, under Section 31B, the statute says that the Income Tax Act attachments will not be, cannot override the rights of a secured creditor if the mortgage is prior. The mortgage has to be prior.
So once you are sharing that judgment, just incorporate that judgment also. We will share it on the WhatsApp.
I can give you the judgment right away. That is
I would say in a consolidated form. Once you're giving the judgments, once we are sharing on the WhatsApp group,
I will be able to get it, but you may not find this judgment because this is the very just now I took this. This is V. Sridhar versus the authorized officer, Indian Bank. No, I'm sorry, not that. It's another judgment. This is Indian Overseas Bank. The judgment that I am talking about is Indian Overseas Bank versus, please give me a minute. Yes, the State Tax Officer, WP number 25394 of 2013. You can just Google it, it's available. Indian Overseas Bank versus the State Tax Officer.
Okay. You just give the written number in that, people can find it on the Google. No, in the compendium itself, we will share it on the WhatsApp group. You can subsequently share this judgment.
Yes,
they will at least Google it out. And once it's a full bench, it will be reported also. Ma'am, can you enlighten us with the procedure of Section 13(4) of symbolic possession and what needs to be kept for no fault in the procedure?
As far as Section 13(4) is concerned, there is no differentiation in the Act between an actual possession and a symbolic possession. The court has held in several cases, including Noble Kumar versus Standard Chartered Bank, that there is no differentiation between a symbolic possession and an actual possession. However, it is up to the bank to decide on whatever it would want to take. For a symbolic possession to be in order, the authorized officer has to prepare a possession notice as far as possible as per Appendix 4. The possession notice must be served on the borrower without demur. If there are more than one borrowers, they must also be served. In case the possession notice is not served and the envelopes are returned back, they must be preserved because at a later point of time under Section 17(1), proof of service of the demand notice or proof of having taken the effort to serve the demand notice must be established before the DRT. Thereafter, this possession notice must also be published in an English paper as well as in a vernacular paper. The English newspaper as well as the vernacular newspaper must have wide publicity. Then the possession notice must also be affixed in a conspicuous part of the property. And it is not only that affixture, it is during this affixture that care must be taken by the bank to take pictures proving that it had indeed affixed the possession notice in the property. Possession notice must be visible in the wall. The authorized officer must also be clearly visible. The dates must be visible. That is how a possession can be established without any deviations. As far as actual possession is concerned, for an actual possession to be taken by the bank, an application needs to be filed before the Chief Judicial Magistrate. Earlier, there was a judgment which said that only district magistrates had the power, but now the judgment has been watered down and it says CJM as well as the district magistrate are entitled to hand over to pass orders with respect to taking actual possession. Now, while filing an application for taking actual possession under Section 14, there are 9 criteria that are laid down under the Act, which must be mandatorily furnished in the petition that is filed before the CJM seeking for actual possession. Those are like the demand notice, the amount due, the date of NPA, whether possession was taken or not, whether demand notice was served, whether there was an objection under 13(3)A and whether it was answered. So there are almost 9 points that will also be found in the judgment of Noble Kumar. Along with that, an affidavit is mandatorily to be filed by the authorized officer before the CJM. And on the filing of this application, an order for taking actual possession under Section 14 would be passed. If there is even a mild deviation in any one of the requirements under Section 14, the order of the CJM can be set aside. So this is how you go with a symbolic possession and an actual possession.
Before we will leave for the day, though I would be knowing just one position, because in some cases we have seen that the SJM does not allow the possession, even if you write to them. So what is the remedy according to you?
If the SJM is refusing to pass an order in a petition that is made for handing over the possession, it is well within your remedy to approach the High Court and either get a direction that he must pass orders, or in case he passes an order which is wrong, then you can always quash the orders, because an order and a job, or rather the duty of a chief judicial magistrate or a district magistrate under section 14 is not that of an adjudicatory position. He is not there to adjudicate. It is merely an assistance that he renders to the authorized officer. The duty is the procedures that are scrupulously followed him to send notices to the borrower. The borrower is in possession of the property. Whereas if, am I audible, Vikas?
Yes.
Yes. So if for instance, if there is going to be a tenant in the property, then notice becomes mandatory. But where there is no tenant in the property, a borrower does not even need to be put on notice. It is merely the duty of the CJM to check the papers, and if everything is in order, the order has to be passed. He has no reason or he has no jurisdiction to adjudicate a matter. If he does that, then you can impugn it before the High Court.
That property will be covered by the judgment of its Nobel Kumar only, by Justice Chandrachud.
Standard
Justice Chandrachud, wherein various directions have been given to the effect while he was in probably in the Bombay High Court.
Yes. Nobel Kumar was of the Supreme Court judgment.
No, one of the judgments of Justice Chandrachud while in a division bench, wherein he says it does not have the powers of adjudication, it does not, it cannot refuse. Then it had dilated on 10 particular issues to that effect. Pardon?
There was also another set of argument that came about to be counter section. They said the orders had to be passed compulsorily within 3 months, and that was also not accepted by the High Court, which said that it is not possible and it is only directory, it cannot be mandatory. The CJM is entitled to pass orders even after a lapse of 3 months. So that is how the law in section 14 has evolved.
That judgment also, ma'am, you just share that of Justice Chandrachud. Plus, there is one more judgment I will also check into, which says that it's not adjudicatory authority, but it has to help in the possession of the land. The last question is, we will take any other questions. As per section 13, subclause 9, in case of a consortium, whether a single bank can take action if it has 60% value without taking consent of other consortium members, and whether there is any judgment to that effect.
On that, I am not aware of a judgment, but I can definitely say what is there in the Act. Section 13(9) talks of the consortium agreement. Please give me a moment. In the case of financing or a joint financing, no secured creditor shall be entitled to exercise and pursuant unless exercise is up to not less than 60%. So if a bank is going to be having 60% of the rights in a consortium, it is well within, it is open to them to take measures under this FPC. Because what is said there is that the exercise of that right has to be agreed by the secured creditor representing not less than 60%. So if there is going to be a 60%, well, then it is well within their right to exercise their power to move under surface.
Now, perchance there's one question on the Facebook, and then we call for the day. Mahir Vivek, can the attachment of property of a grantor be done under the garb of section 19 of RDDFI Act when the original application is pending?
Can you repeat that question?
Can the attachment of the property of a grantor be done under the garb of section 19 of RDDFI when the original application is pending?
Yes, you can definitely attach a property of a guarantor when an original application is pending. But there are a couple of preconditions that must be necessarily satisfied for an attachment application to be allowed by a DRT. Even when an application for an attachment is filed, the bank has to prove that there is a severe undersecurity, that there is a case of an undersecurity or that they are undersecured. And that has to be proved by putting forth a valuation report of all the properties that are already available with the bank towards a realization of its due. If the bank is able to establish that, then the court passes an order directing the guarantor or the borrower, as the case may be, to furnish security. The prayer has to be made to furnish security. Only if the guarantor or the borrower fails to furnish security, the property can be attached. But yes, interim attachment is possible.
Since he is touching about the guarantor, large number of participants would also like to know, because
we know that the guarantor's liability is coextensive with that of the borrower. It is as good as a borrower's liability. There can be no wriggling out of a liability on the ground that he is only a mere guarantor. That is the position of law. That is the settled position of law.
SBI versus Impex.
Sorry?
1990 Supreme Court, SBI versus Impex, and probably Satyavati Tandon also. Justice Singhvi's judgment, which says that it's a joint and coextensive liability. You have to proceed. You can proceed either against the guarantor or a borrower, because the liability is joint and coextensive. You cannot say that first proceed against the borrower and then you proceed against the guarantor. And with this, we come to an end to the engaging webinar, which we have all got enlightened on the day of Ganesh Chaturthi. And before we part for the day, tomorrow we would be having a webinar on right to private defense under the Indian Penal Code by a former judge of Bombay High Court and who has just demitted the office of Lokayukt Maharashtra, Justice M.L. Tayani. So right to private defense, Indian Penal Code. Tomorrow again, being a weekend, we will be connecting at 6 p.m. So stay connected, stay safe, and enjoy the festival and be enlightened with the knowledge. As they say, Ganesha also helps in the enlightenment of the knowledge, and that's the way to move forward. And on behalf of Beyond Law CLC, I would like to thank Ma'am Ananda Gomti Murgesan to having given the insight. Your senior had left here to go for a webinar. Mr. Parthasarthi said, kindly convey my wishes and to say that you have actually conveyed the message in the right perspective. So all those participants who are watching us live on the Facebook, as well as those who will watch subsequently on the YouTube channel of Beyond Law CLC, we will be uploading this webinar, and the previous sessions of the Beyond Law CLC also stands uploaded on the YouTube channel of Beyond Law CLC. You can watch them, and all those participants who have been watching us on the platform, again, wishing you happy Ganesh Chaturthi, and everyone stay safe, stay blessed, and keep sharing. As they say, sharing is caring, especially during these testing times. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.